CNN, February 1st, 2025. Trump announces significant new tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, sparking retaliatory actions. And of course, this was warned about by President Trump before he even took office. On the campaign trail, he warned of higher tariffs. This is always interpreted as some sort of Trump policy, but in reality, while this did begin under the first Trump administration, people have to remember that it continued uninterrupted under the Biden administration. All of the tariffs Trump put in place were kept in place by the Biden administration. The Biden administration actually implemented additional tariffs. 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, for example. I'm going to go over CSIS. This is a U.S. government arms industry, U.S. corporate financier funded think tank, their take on the Biden administration's tariffs, so that you can understand that this has nothing to do with Trump or Biden. This is the foreign policy, the trade policy of unelected U.S. corporate financier special interests, and this is all to do with containing China. And not just contain China, but to decouple the United States from China, so that when the U.S., not if, when the United States provokes war with China, it has already completed the process of decoupling, especially essential raw materials and components required for its military industrial base. This is what they are doing. This is what they are openly doing. And I'm trying to warn people about this. Now, I posted on both X and Telegram a point-by-point breakdown of these tariffs. So I'm going to go over them, and I'm going to add additional information when and if necessary. So the first point was that it should be remembered that Trump's previous bad tariffs, because remember, critics of Trump said the tariffs were bad, were not only kept in place under the Biden administration, as I just pointed out, they were expanded upon over the last 4 years, indicating this is a bipartisan, and if you want to use the term, deep state agenda. This is not Trump versus the deep state. This is Trump in service of the deep state. Whatever you think the deep state is, there are unelected special interests that drive U.S. foreign policy, regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress. And the fact that Trump implemented tariffs during his first administration, Biden kept them in place and added to them, and now Trump is again expanding upon them. This should be a wake-up call to the fact that this is continuity of agenda. This is not an idea President Trump and his administration had. This was something they were told to do, and they are doing it. They're simply slapping the MAGA brand on it. These tariffs, follow-up tariffs, I guess you could say, follow-up tariffs on both the first Trump administration and Biden administration's tariffs, are not only on China, but now also on Canada and Mexico. And these are aimed at further permanently decoupling the U.S. from China. And this is because China began investing in manufacturing in Mexico, in Canada, so that they could get around sanctions, bans, and tariffs that the U.S. was placing on them directly. And of course, not only does this benefit China, it also benefited Mexico and Canada. It also benefited American consumers. They are getting a steady supply of cheap, affordable goods. The tariffs, and ask any American still living in the United States, because of the tariffs, the cost of living is going up. All of these goods are now rising in cost. The goal of these tariffs is to decouple the United States from China permanently. This is being spun to the public as a reaction to fentanyl and illegal immigration. The United States is saying to Canada and Mexico, we are going to apply these tariffs on you if you cannot secure your borders and stop the flow of drugs and immigration through them and into the United States. But just think about the logic here for even just a moment, to just see through how transparently absurd this explanation is. If the U.S. itself is helpless to stop the flow of drugs and illegal immigration into its borders. How is Canada and Mexico supposed to do this? Smaller population, less resources, smaller militaries. How are they supposed to do this and succeed where the United States has absolutely, completely, allegedly failed? And the answer is, it's unreasonable. It does not make any sense. The United States could secure its borders. It could stop the flow of illegal drugs throughout its communities if it wanted to. They're accusing China of supplying the precursor chemicals for fentanyl specifically. If China is producing the precursors to fentanyl, how come China doesn't have a fentanyl pandemic ravaging its society, its whole population? And the reason is effective law enforcement. What is stopping the US from using effective law enforcement within its own borders? So this is an excuse. This is a fabricated pretext. This is not a real reason to apply tariffs to China or to Canada or to Mexico. This is all about permanently decoupling from China ahead of a war with China. Tariffs have precipitated a cost of living crisis in the United States. And I also mention a similar cost of living crisis, an energy price crisis in Europe, linked to sanctions on Russia, related to Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, which is essentially a US-European proxy war against Russia. It is a crisis both the Trump and Biden administrations are clearly indifferent to. In other words, they don't care about the cost of living crisis American consumers face. They don't care. This is about decoupling the US from China ahead of war with China. And the American people are going to be the ones that pay the price, because ultimately, why does the United States want war with China in the first place? Why are they trying to contain them? Why are they trying to encircle them? Why are they preparing a global maritime blockade against China? Because US corporations are deeply entrenched monopolies. They are incapable of competing. China is outcompeting them. They are going to lose their power, their profits, their influence worldwide. They will also lose it even within the boundaries of the collective West itself. So this is what they are doing to react to this threat. Rather than reforming themselves systemically, they are going to shift the burden onto not just the American consumer, but also the American taxpayer. I will get into that in just a moment. The goal is very obviously to prepare for war with China, including a blockade of Chinese maritime shipping. U.S. moves against Panama and Greenland both serve as steps toward preparing that. I just recently wrote an article for New Eastern Outlook, and I will do a whole video on that article. And it was about a recent interview with newly appointed and confirmed U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and he's talking about seizing the Panama Canal and annexing Greenland, including with an implicit threat of military force. Why are they doing that? And the answer is, and he even admits this during the interviews, because they need to control shipping lanes. That is what it's about. And he mentioned it not just in regards to the Panama Canal, but specifically in regards to Greenland. Shipping lanes. Remember, this is what I warned people about when talk of annexing Greenland and the Panama Canal, seizing the Panama Canal. I warned that this was about maritime blockades against China. And now Marco Rubio is specifically saying this is about controlling sea lanes. But it's not just under the Trump administration. Again, under the Biden administration for a full 4 years, the entire U.S. Marine Corps was completely reconfigured into an anti-shipping missile force. So they were a force that had air power, sea power, land power. They had warplanes, helicopters, they had boats, they had the US Navy bringing them to shore, they had tanks and other armored vehicles, they had artillery. They have exchanged most of this for anti-shipping missiles. They completely forfeited their tank force, an unprecedented restructuring of any US military branch. completely forfeited their tanks in exchange for missile systems that are primarily going to be used to target shipping, Chinese shipping, maritime shipping, naval ships. This is what the US Marine Corps for 4 years under the Biden administration was prepared to do. In conjunction with the tariffs during the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now this Trump administration. So these are coordinated preparations for war with China. They are preparing to strangle Chinese maritime shipping worldwide as part of war on China directly. And before this, they need to decouple from China. That is what all of this is in preparation for. So China and its trading partners, which is virtually the entire world, need to realistically face this and prepare for this US plan to strangle not just China, but multipolarism in the cradle. Negotiations with the US must be done with this in mind, realizing the US has no intention of ever striking an actual deal, but is instead preparing the battlefield. So if you are going to negotiate with the United States over tariffs, over trade, you're doing it to buy yourself time, to create the most favorable conditions for yourself to prepare as the US prepares. And what is the US preparing? It is preparing the battlefield for war with China. And again, this is not going to be a head-on battle off of China's coast or even storming Chinese coasts. This is going to be a global maritime blockade. The US uses its asymmetrical military power to implement. The fact that the US military cannot fight China head on, but because of its being stretched around the globe, it can cut off Chinese shipping, and there's very little China and its military can do to stop it. This is what they are preparing for, almost openly. China's ability to innovate and replace US imports, as well as diversify and protect alternative exports elsewhere from US destabilization, both regime change in installing anti-China client regimes and the backing of violence targeting Belt and Road Initiative routes, will determine the outcome of Washington's actual objectives. So not only is the US decoupling, using tariffs and using false pretexts like fentanyl and illegal immigration, as they are decoupling from China and as their military industrial base is looking for alternatives ahead of the conflict rather than doing it during the conflict, they are also preparing their military, the posture of its military around the globe, and the constitution of the military, the components of the military, to implement a global maritime blockade. And again, that is why the US is talking about seizing the Panama Canal. That is why they are talking about seizing Greenland. This is why the US military has tens of thousands of troops in the Asia-Pacific region. This is why they maintain a constant military presence in and around the South China Sea. This is why they're so heavily invested in the Chinese island province of Taiwan. They are looking at everywhere Chinese shipping passes through, and they're looking for a way to disrupt it. In addition to that, because China understands this, they have understood this for decades, actually. This is a US plan spanning many decades. They began building the Belt and Road Initiative. These are overland routes that are supposed to circumvent choke points, maritime choke points the US will use its military to strangle. The problem is the US is also targeting and attempting to cut and strangle these Belt and Road Initiative routes. For example, and I've covered this many times, the US since 2011 has been talking about backing armed terrorists in Baluchistan, southwest Pakistan, to specifically cut the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The US is also backing armed militants in Southeast Asia's Myanmar. There is a Belt and Road pipeline and port that runs through Myanmar into Kunming, China. US-backed militants have been attacking that directly, openly, blatantly, and other Chinese investments all across Myanmar here in Southeast Asia. The United States spent millions of dollars and many years trying to maneuver a US-backed client regime into power here in Thailand. One of the billionaire leaders or frontmen of this US-backed political party was Tanaton Juang Grung Gruang Git, and he openly said that he wanted to stop the construction of the China-Thailand high-speed rail line. He was going to use non-existent Hyperloop technology that didn't exist at the time he proposed it and now has been permanently canceled. He was going to use that as an alternative. Of course, it wasn't an alternative, and the reality was the US was just blocking infrastructure. And if you zoom out and you look at this entire policy, the tariffs, the trade war, here, let's go to CSIS and look at this. This was not actually in reaction to the Trump tariffs. This was actually in reaction to the Biden administration tariffs, which were added on to the first Trump administration tariffs and are now being built upon by the second Trump administration. So experts react, energy and trade implications of tariffs on Chinese imports. And I'm not going to read all of this. The link will be in the video description below. But let's just look let's just scan through it. With new tariffs, are cost and climate policy at odds? And what they're admitting is that this climate policy that the Biden administration always talked about, always said it was prioritizing, was eviscerated by the tariffs Biden administration itself placed on China. 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Chinese electric vehicles are actually cheap enough, efficient enough, plentiful enough to help a nation like the US transition from combustion engines to electric vehicles, if that is a goal that your administration has. That is a good way to do it. There are no US-based car manufacturers capable of producing electric vehicles for as cheap or as numerous or vehicles that are as efficient as Chinese electric vehicles. If we go through here, we will see them talking about solar panels also, right here. So again, you're talking about transitioning from fossil fuels to solar energy, other alternative energy sources, and yet you're going to put tariffs on a country that actually makes this technology accessible and efficient and viable. You're going to tariff them and remove that from the equation. So obviously the Biden administration's climate policy was just a way of imposing restrictions, handicapping the developing world, not to actually inhibit the US itself. It was never serious about any sort of climate policy. It always used climate policy as a way to handicap the developing world. The irony is that China not only continued developing industrially and then began surpassing the United States, it did so while mass producing electric vehicles and solar panels and making a transition to alternative energy. It is the ultimate irony. What else was the US trying to target? They're talking about mineral security goals. And again, this is the military industrial base. They're getting a lot of their inputs from China, and they understand that if they go to war with China, if they implement a blockade on China, they will have no access to these minerals. So they need to start the process of diversifying away from Chinese sources now, before conflict rather than in the middle of conflict. So that is a significant reason why they are doing this. What about this? Tariff increases on legacy chips. And we keep hearing this term, overproduction, overcapacity. This term overcapacity, we keep hearing about overcapacity. In reality, the United States for decades had a monopoly on high technology, and they could, just like OPEC, they could determine the supply and demand, the prices, they could control all of this. They could create artificial scarcity and create artificially astronomical profits for themselves. And that is what they have been doing with virtually every aspect of their economy. Now with China, now with the multipolar world rising, they are panicking because a nation like China can not only produce the same sort of high technology the US can, they can do it much better, much faster, more efficiently, and for much cheaper. They can make it accessible to absolutely everyone. The ability to create artificial scarcity and artificially high prices and astronomical profits for yourself is no longer a possibility. So that is why they are targeting China. This is the imperative that is driving them. They need to stop this or their entire way of life will disappear. Now, what is that way of life? Is that the way of life for the American people? No, it is the way of life for a very tiny percentage of special interests that are profiting at the expense of the American people and everyone else on Earth. So again, they talk about the cost of living. They talk about the cost of diversifying supply chains and how difficult that will be for other businesses that are going to be affected by tariffs. Who ultimately is going to be impacted? It's going to be taxpayers who have to watch more of their money be diverted from actually being spent in America for Americans and instead being used to find alternative sources for input material for the military industrial base. They will also have to watch commercial businesses, consumer goods, raise their prices. They're not going to shoulder the extra cost of the tariffs. They're going to transfer that to the consumers. So taxpayers and consumers, they're the ones that are going to pay for these tariffs. China, of course, has demonstrated an ability to innovate its way around these tariffs, to adapt to them. They have been able to find alternative markets. If China understands that the United States isn't actually pressuring them as a means of negotiation, but as a means of preparing for war, they themselves will have realized that they should try to take advantage of trade with the United States for as long as possible, but they have to begin preparing for the inevitable, which is complete decoupling. And of course, other ways the United States is going to target them and their ability to trade with other nations, their ability to continue advancing and expanding their own industrial technological base. So these are all the actual core issues behind tariffs. This is not a Trump policy. This was not a Biden policy. This is the policy of unelected special interests trying to preserve their monopolies, their profits, their power over the rest of the planet and prevent the emergence of a multipolar world where profit, technology, and all of the benefits that it offers are available to everybody. They do not want to see a world like that emerge. They're quite okay with all the profits and the benefits residing solely in their hands. So that is where the battle lines are actually drawn. I hope people are not going to fall for the MAGA branding. If you actually believe that what Trump is doing is MAGA, America First policy, ask yourself why the Biden administration spent 4 years advancing this exact same policy for the exact same actual reasons. Ask yourself, was President Biden an American First candidate? You know, that's what you would have to believe that these tariffs had anything to do with America First. So this is where the battle lines are being drawn. We need to understand that this is not about America trying to, as Carl Zah was saying recently, I listen to him almost every week as well. He was talking about trade deficit between the US and China. And of course, China obviously exports far more to the US than it imports from the US. But there are things that China desperately wants to buy from the US. They can't buy enough from the US. And among those things were microchips and graphic processors used for artificial intelligence. The US is cutting China off from these and forcing China to develop their own and no longer depend on the US. That was something China was happy to give their money to the US for, and the US is saying no. So was it really about balancing trade, or is it about containing China, preventing China from developing, preventing any nation from developing? And I want to just refresh everybody's memories. This is and always has been US foreign policy. US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. This was 1992, but this has been US foreign policy since before and after World War II, from 1992 all the way up until today, whether it's the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and whether it was a Harris administration or not. That is America's foreign policy. It is not a foreign policy that serves American interests in terms of the American people. It serves special interests. That's who it serves. That's who it benefits. It comes at the expense of absolutely everyone else on Earth, including the American people. I will continue keeping an eye on this. Look out for my video and article about the interview with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the true colors of the Trump administration's foreign policy, shown for all to see. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my work is published on YouTube, Telegram, X, and also Rumble. So if you don't want to watch my videos on YouTube, that is fine. I post them on other platforms as well. Check the video description below for all of those other places you can find and follow my work. I have a blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. I post all of my articles and videos on there as well. There's a lot of old articles from back before I did videos and I wrote under various pen names. I have well over 2,000 articles on everything from the Arab Spring to US, Chinese, Russian relations and conflict. So go there, check that out. As a matter of fact, I just want to point this out to people. There is a search bar right here, and you just type in any term, type it in there, and you will see whether or not I've written an article on it about it. I've been writing since 2010, just about. Also in the video description are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel, X, Rumble. I don't monetize any of these social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, again, the links are in the video description below. Please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no extra resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with other people, helping get the word out, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.